Well then, good morning everybody. My name is Reinhard Kreissl, as you can see from the slides. And the topic is perceptions of security. You might have encountered this famous phrase, security is like nailing the pudding to the wall. There are many definitions and many attempts to nail it down. And security is a contested concept. It's used in political contexts. And one of my favorite definitions that I ran into was security, trying to define security as a dynamic non-event. That was really a great one. So security is a dynamic non-event. That was in a book about human factors of security. So difficult to define, and what I would suggest to do is look at different level of security discourse. And this is a kind of a analytical or heuristic distinction that we made also in our societal security report that we produced for the SOURCE project. So you have the level of the media hype on security, so what you read the headlines, from this anthrax thing that I quoted from Saracen, but now also Ebola, refugees, or all kind of crime waves that are supposed to be a big problem for societies. Then you have what we call the everyday concerns of lay persons. So what is this, people on the street thinking? So we have this media stuff. What do you say? Like right now, it's the refugee thing, or it used to be a couple of months ago. Used to be the Brexit problem, financial security, or terrorism, or like the Ebola outbreak. These things make headlines as security concerns. But how does it affect, how does it resonate with the everyday concerns of lay persons, lay people? How do you approach that? And then we had that third level or third approach, a third perspective, which we call the infrastructural security. This is those things or those problems that are rarely considered, or they don't make the headlines but still are important and still raise some, or should raise some security concerns. Like, that starts from logistic chains to financial systems to logistic chains, public transport, what else? All kinds of things that are usually discussed in the domains of experts, which are not visible and don't have that sex appeal of making headlines, but still have to be considered. Now, for each of these different domain or approaches, there are different methodologies, and they make up altogether, they make up the politics of security. And of course, talking about levels of security discourse, that's a way of addressing the way we talk about security. And beyond that security discourse, the level of discourse, there are motivations, interests, driving forces that can be addressed or have to be taken into account when you really want to understand how this discourse, these different types of discourse work. I'll run through these, take this as a kind of a organizing principle, looking at the media hype, at the everyday and the infrastructural security, and then do a brief wrap-up and look at some of the problems that emerge or some of the findings that you can get when you work in this area. Let's start with the media hype. I took here just from 2015 a couple of media hyped events that made headlines in the area of terrorism. So you see how there was, of course, the Charlie Hebdo at the beginning, and the Paris attacks here at the end of the year and in between. So these were all events that were discussed in the media, that were for a couple of days or weeks, and that had, of course, some effect. We looked at a couple of sources, such as Google Analytics and also Wikipedia hit rates, and when you do this, you get a couple of, this is over a period of 9 months from January to September 2015, and you see the hit rates of Al-Qaeda, the entry of Al-Qaeda. So there's a hype, a spike at the beginning. This is the Charlie Hebdo thing. And then what you have in September, that's the anniversary of the 9/11 thing. It goes up there as well. And that gives you some, that can be used as a kind of a non-reactive indicator to understand how certain topics or certain keywords or certain concepts resonate with public discourse. Okay, this was like, okay, we had something like 50 or 60 key concepts that we used and that we followed and that we analyzed throughout the year. And we do this on an annual basis. It would be interesting to see how this develops over a 5-year period, which is the time the source project will run. Here is also, that's the financial crisis. This is very typical, a very typical figure, because it was in June last year when the Brexit topic was scoring high on public discourse and making headlines. So. And you see suddenly there's an interest in that and then it goes down again. So this is a typical thing that very often there's a security problem which is considered to be serious and really a threat to Europe, a threat to the world, a threat to society, and everybody's talking about it. Everybody's very concerned, and there's a heated debate going on, and suddenly it's up there and then it's gone again. We did Twitter analysis. We sampled every day something, I don't know, 300,000 to 400,000 tweets, and filtering these tweets for a number of keywords. And there was on April the 22nd, there was a big hype in security, and we tried to figure out where that came from, and that was from a tweet from a guy who's up, I don't know, something must be a pop group or something, or a boy group, anyway, some kind of public hero, and they went back to the UK and they were staying at the airport, and here you can see the tweet, and that was retweeted, I know, as you see, 105,000 times, and that's how we had this spike or this in security. So one has to be careful. This is a problem, generally a problem that you have when you try to go beyond the analysis of headlines, when you're trying to figure out what resonates with public discourse. Because security can, as a term in itself, can be used in very different contexts, and that not all of them must be, well, same with crime, that all of them must be security related in the sense that we understand. So if you follow up the headlines over here, you see a whole array, a wide variety of security relevant issues at the media level. And of course that's the dynamic of the media, because the media, they have to come up with a headline that will be better than the headline of their competitors. And you have this general problem which has been discussed in media studies of over-reporting. So now the standard approach to looking at the everyday concerns of laypersons is to do a survey. This is a slide from Eurobarometer 371, special Eurobarometer, something 2010, 2011. The question was, what do you think are the most important challenges to the security of, and then comes the nationality, of citizens at the moment? And here the EU, was it EU27 in this case? This survey provides you with tick boxes. You can say, okay, it's economic and financial crisis, terrorism, it's poverty, organized crime, corruption, etc., and goes on. Nuclear disasters, religious extremism, others, spontaneous, garbage can category. Giving people these choices, fixed choices, that's the only thing that they can respond to. And then you get what you could expect, of course, is like, I don't know, where was Greece? So the Greeks are most concerned about the financial crisis. The Danish, interestingly, are most concerned about terrorism. This was in the year where the, this cartoon thing was happening. And the funny thing is that in the internal security strategy of the European Union in, I don't know, 2010 or what, they had a couple of main issues like terrorism, migration, organized crime, I don't know, whatever, but they left out financial crime. They left out the financial security of the financial system. So these things can happen. Yeah? There's a big policy paper, but this policy paper simply ignores an upcoming security concern. Huh? And I'll give you an example, which I think is a good demonstration of the reflexivity or of the internal dynamics of how such concerns come into being, like the crime rate, so which is the crime figure that is released by the police on an annual basis. And when you look at the dynamic that is involved, you can see that when you start in the right upper angle, corner here, the police and law enforcement agencies, they about 80 to 90%, and this has been demonstrated in a couple of studies on so-called news-making criminology, up to 80 to 90% of the information that goes to the media and that are reported in the media on crime issues are from police sources. So you rarely get something from defense attorneys or any NGOs or any other sources. 80 to 90% come from police sources. So the police, they shape, they mold the picture, the concepts, the ideas that are transported through the media. So all the ideas about the, right now, like the crime conducted or the crime problem created by asylum seekers or by foreigners, which is a big debate in in many European countries, and all that is from the media. Huh? And you can tell people, if you look at the evidence, at the figures, and say, okay, if you become a victim of a serious crime, a serious attack, like if you get murdered, 90% of the murder happens within the family. So this notion of, the black man standing behind the corner and hitting you on your head and killing you, this is nonsense. Because if you look at the evidence, if someone goes after you, it's your spouse, it's your father, it's your son, it's all within the immediate family context. Huh? But this is not the image that is transported through the media. So what you see is a kind of a vicious cycle or a feedback cycle, where you can see that what the police knows is based on what the people tell them. What people tell them is based on what they read in the news. What they read in the news is based on what the police tell the news. So you get this kind of, and you can draw these kind of circles in for many different areas of security. This distinction in the debate about subjective or security perceived versus quote-unquote objective security, which I think is a nonsense, but it's pretty well rehearsed in the discussion about security. And the security perceived refers to what people think about security. And these studies, they show a number of paradoxes. One that has been proven a couple of times is this, that people who have a very low probability of victimization at the same time show a high fear. So like the proverbial old lady who is living on her own in an apartment in the city, she has that high fear of crime. Oh, I'm going to be mugged, I'm going to be burglar, someone's going to break into my home. And statistically, that's nonsense. And on the other hand, you have your standard young rascals, age of 15 to 25 years. Say, I have no fear of crime, but they have a high probability of being victimized within their own peer group. This is one of the paradoxes. And the other paradox is an interesting thing that has to be considered, which is in most cases is not considered. It's also not considered in the fear of crime service, is that security is essentially a byproduct. So at the level of individual perceptions, if you ask someone, do you feel secure? You immediately open a kind of a cognitive frame or a mindset that people start to think about it. Security is, I put these quotes below this because it's a kind of like the like these paradoxes that you know from communication theory. So just tell you, don't think of a pink elephant. So what you do is you start thinking about a pink elephant. Or the other thing is, if you with your partner and you ask the person you stay with, do you love me? And the answer will be, why do you ask me that? And you suddenly start to get into a discourse, into a frame, a cognitive framing, that makes something a topic that used to be, or that typically exists in the back without being questioned. And the others are, that the one from the Watzlawick, be spontaneous, telling someone to be spontaneous simply is a paradox, or don't obey my orders. So there's no rational response to that. The key message to take home with is this security as a byproduct. Security exists when you don't think about it. As soon as you start to think about security, you feel insecure, or you start to, you look at the world with this difference of security, insecure. Am I secure? Am I insecure? Security simply is what Tony Giddens a couple of years used to call the ontological security. So the belief that the world is as it is, unquestionable, that things move smoothly, that routines exist, routines are going on, and tomorrow will be a replication of what happened today, and the future will be a replication of the past. And you don't think about this, then in these conditions you feel secure. When you start to question this, you come into a state of insecurity. And that's what, of course, this is the problem that all the security research at the level of everyday perceptions has to address. Now, we solved this problem. Well, not really, but we were concerned about this problem and did not approach our subjects with directly with questions about security. We started with kind of a quality of life. So how is your life? How's your everyday? What are your problems every day? And then particularly don't work along a predefined schedule, but give the respondents the time to unfold their narrative. And there's one point, which is the third point, which I think is very important. There are a number of groups of people that are not considered, like the homeless, the illegals, also people who don't speak the language of the country, sex workers, prostitutes. These kind of people are typically left out in the in your standard survey. So we try to. This was an explicit objective of our approach. We try to let's try to talk to those people who typically don't have a voice. Okay, follow up on their stories. Let them develop the stories. Talk to people in their natural habitat. If you bring a homeless people to a university research institute, they will be very insecure, which is another kind of insecurity problem. And try to use their vernacular, which is interesting because the vocabulary that we use to talk about security is not common coinage in the everyday world. So when you try to get data and you try to approach security from this in this bottom-up way, you get a quite different image, a quite different impression of what security concerns are. Most of the security concerns actually are the standard, what used to be social security. So it's not a threat-based thing, like people, what's threatening me? It's more the risk-based. I hope everything remains as it is. And these are just a couple of quotes from the interviews, from the two of them. See, from Norway, Netherlands, and from Netherlands and Norway. So the one is a typical thing is this health thing. So people say, okay, if my health is okay. If there are friends and family I can rely on, if I have a good job. So these are the kind of topics that come into play when you try to talk about security. So you talk about quality of life, and then you say, just open this frame, quality of life, and then you say, okay, what does security mean? What makes you feel secure? Yeah? And this is the kind of response that you get. Health situation, family situation, friend. relying on a social network that's there, and also simply that things stay the way they are, like in the second. I think security is that if I go to my work in the morning, nothing happened till I get home at night, and everything is still the same. So having this continuity in your life, or simply this fatalist say, okay, people are aware of terrorist problems, that there might be this terrorist situation, that you can become a victim of a terrorist attack, but what the hell? I mean, maybe you're in the wrong place, there's always the risk, but I do not have fear that I'll be a victim. I can't do anything, you know? And this is something which is also, I think, very important, that when you look at the also at the media hype, creating this permanent arousal of, you know, there's the big security threat, and there are things that are threatening, they're just around the corner and they will go after you. You can't live in a permanent state of this arousal. This, what you see here in terms of the attitude of the general fatalistic thing, well, things could happen, but I hope I'm not in the wrong, you can be at the wrong place at the wrong time, but so what? There's nothing you can do about it. As opposed to a political reaction that has to demonstrate simply we're doing something. And I think the last quote is very important also, because what we found out, and what is often forgotten, is that for a quite substantial number of people, for quite a number of groups, the security forces themselves are a security threat. So if you're, like in this case, a migrant sex worker, her one of her major security concerns are the police. And you also find this among young migrants, who had this in a different study. Well, what do you think is what are you afraid of when you walk through the city? They say, we're afraid of the police. It's not threat-based. Crime is not the general problem. And all these media-hyped security issues, they're not as important. There are many, many mundane, many trivial, many standard, old-school social security type of issues that are considered to be security relevant, but not those topics that make the headlines. You get these topics that make, as I said, showed you before in the Eurobarometer table. If you give them this as a fixed choice and say, okay, here are the big problems like terrorism, financial crimes, organized crime, then of course you get the responses. But if you give people time and space to develop their own ideas, you come up with a very different understanding, or different reading of security, and different priorities, different rankings. The last type of discourse or perspective that we're looking at, and we did this in our annual societal security report simply by sending out a questionnaire to security experts, so people working in European projects on security, or working as consultants to cybersecurity, environmental security, etc. Now, we call this the infrastructural security problems. We're dealing here with complex systems, time-critical processes, cascading effects, also systems that have a high volatility, which are beyond central control, such as the power grids, climate, refugees, financial system. That's a different security discourse, and it has a different morphology, a different logic, a different structure. And interestingly, these are topics that are, except for the financial system to some extent, these are problems that don't make the headlines. Typical concerns where the experts say, our voices often go unheard. So we know what the problem would be, but the politicians don't listen to us. And the problem is the typical black swan problem. So like in the power grid problem or public transport problem, an attack on a public transport system, like the Madrid, London bombings, etc. These are rare events with high impact, and making security a major concern, a design of a system, is not what is high on the agenda for the system provider for the management of these critical infrastructures. And what is I mean, that was expected, but I loved the one that most of the people that responded said, well, there's further research is needed. We have to do this and that, and it's a typical thing, competing for resources. So we don't know enough, we have to know more. We have to better understand these complex systems, how they work, and et cetera, et cetera. There was a standard perspective of the experts. So we do know quite a lot about infrastructure problem, where we should know more, and to do this we need more research. One of the major problems that were mentioned, which is typical, that political cycles and security cycles, if you look at the refugee crisis at the moment, I mean, people are thinking in terms of, people in political power positions, they are thinking in terms of when will be the next election, or when will be the next change of elites in the power system, the political system. And they don't think about it in longer cycles. And this always creates conflicts, because political decisions are always very, in security relevant areas, are always very short-sighted, or populist, short-sighted. And security cycles, or the cycles of security problems, how they emerge, are long, very often very long. So, I mean, the refugee crisis that was in the 1970s, late 70s, there was this report by Olof Palme and Willy Brandt about the North-South conflict, and they were predicting what's happening now. So there will be the old East-West divide will be replaced by a North-South divide. So we will have all these migration problems. We'll have people coming there from conflict areas, from areas in sub-Saharan Africa. That was all. There were these scenarios in there, but nobody read this and nobody reacted to that and nobody did anything. And now things are happening. Say, oh Jesus, what's happening now? We don't know what we should do. And cybersecurity is also a case in where you can demonstrate how this works. That no proper security measures are taken. So the experts, they tend to look at systems and buy into the security reasoning in terms of, calculating risks, calculating probabilities, and having many cases having a very technical approach to the topic. And the ethnographer's view is they take critical infrastructure as a site for empirical investigation. So you can look, for example, at what happens security-wise at an airport. You can look at what happens security-wise in public transport. So the typical standard and security-relevant public infrastructures, and you see how security is managed there and how different interests are involved, and how some ideas that are developed at the top of the hierarchy by the management, how they are implemented or not implemented, and how organizations think, and all these kind of stuff. And you get a completely different view then on security problems. And there's this phrase, you might have heard, the security theater, and it simply shows how security is sort of performed on the front stage, but the backstage, very different things are happening. Most of the experts, they buy into the language and the mindset of the management of the critical infrastructure. They have this talk of risk and target hardening and risk assessment and training, etc. And the ethnographers, they always have this almost countercultural, you could say, this bottom-up approach. Like I always use that with the students when doing methodology courses, and I always use that phrase, which is, I think, also the basic approach for this ethnography of critical infrastructure. If you want to know the truth about the cats, you better talk to the mice, which means that problems of infrastructure security can be discussed with the management, but they also should be discussed with the field operatives, the people who really run the system, and you get a completely different picture then. Okay, so where does it leave us? Just a few points at the end. Security definitely is not a household word. No? When people talk about security, the layperson, which is the majority of people talk about security, they don't use it in that sense. No? But still, there are security issues which are differently labeled. Typically, security topics are provided by media and policy actors. One issue that I didn't cover didn't touch upon that, but I think that's important also to consider always that big security is big business, and we have that security industrial political complex, which is important when you investigate, that you always look at these relations, particularly in the field of infrastructure. I was sitting for a couple of years on the advisory group of the European Commission for the development of the security research program and the 7th framework program. And this group, I mean, that was composed of independent experts. Put this in 3 quotation marks, and 90% of the independent experts were representatives from the industry, Finmeccanica, Nokia, Saab, and all these guys. And it was quite obvious that the way they spell security is simply this is looking for a technofix, looking for a business case. So every security problem is translated into a technical solution, also into a business case for a big industry. The mindset or the interpretation or the concerns of the everyday person are not identical with the quote-unquote big security problems, the politically defined security problems. And well, that's it, 50 minutes. Let's stop here. Thank you.